Hello and welcome to the Habit Architect. I'm really excited about our guest today. Hello, Tony. How are you?
Hey, Michael, how are you? I'm doing well.
Excellent, excellent. We'll get to an introduction with you in just a moment. But first, I want to mention that we are sponsored by Time Bandit. And also, what's really important about podcasts is getting people to hit that subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever, wherever you're listening to this. Go ahead and hit that follow button because that really helps us out in the long run to know where people are listening and to make continue to make great content. So, little thick tongue here today for some reason, Tony. So I'm glad you're here. I want to talk to Tony is the COO of Rulesware, and we're going to talk today about transformations and really about what makes transformations stick, and particularly a concept around the center of excellence type stuff. And so I urge you to go out and check out Rulesware, rulesware.com, and you can check out Tony on LinkedIn. But we're really excited about this conversation, Tony. So let's get into it. But before we do, why don't you tell us a little bit about your backstory, about what led you to Rulesware, and then kind of a little bit about transformations means what transformations mean to you.
Thanks, Michael. And it's great to be here. And thank you for the invitation to speak. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about. And it's from a history standpoint, it kind of dates my entire kind of career. So my background actually started in education, but then I was recruited into Anderson Consulting in the 90s. I'm dating myself there. And started working in Anderson Consulting, which became Accenture for several years. Then I worked at IBM as an associate partner in their insurance practice, where I spent a couple of years there, and then moved over to Pega Systems, where I spent 16 years. Number one, starting up their insurance practice, and then also over the years, kind of leading their consulting for comms and consumer services. 2 years ago, I left Pega and I joined Rulesware, where, as you mentioned, I'm the COO for the company, responsible for everything from sales, marketing, delivery, and customer success. And so been doing that for the last 2 years. It was a great kind of move from being in very large companies to smaller companies. But as your question asked, as far as transformation and where's that passion come from, it's as I mentioned, almost 25, 30 years in consulting, and I've seen and I've been involved with transformational projects over that period of time in one way or another. A lot of it, and I'll kind of reference this in the topics, is I started off my career at Anderson in Accenture in change management. So I did that for about 9 years, where I was focused on change management, and that's where one of my passions is around kind of change management and making sure that that is part of any transformations. And we'll get into a little bit more down the road about like where some of the failures are, and that kind of relates to my background in change management.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, and you're coming to us from a really great city in the U.S. in Charleston as well. So we, I know we're not going to talk about that. You're not the tourist bureau, but I just wanted to mention it's one of our favorite places. So, all right, well let's get into it. So, I've been in this industry about the same amount as you, or probably maybe a little more. But the interesting thing I see in big companies is there's no failure to start transformations, right? There's a lot of projects that get started. There's a lot of big investments in technology that happen, and some of them are wildly successful. Some of them are wildly unsuccessful, and then some of them just kind of one and done. I mean, what do you think that makes a transformation and rollout more successful? Because they don't make that investment for a one-time thing, right? If they're making it of that size, they're asking their people to learn something new. They're doing something new. So why don't you think more projects succeed like that?
It's interesting, in times have changed, and the whole transformation and DX, digital transformation, has really evolved, I think, over the years, and especially since COVID. I've seen kind of more of a decrease of the big transformations that you would see in the early 2000s, right? I spent a lot of time in my career in consulting, working on large transformational implementations, and they were multi-year and so on. You're not seeing that anymore, right? You're seeing more of smaller kind of, piecemeal kind of transformations, targeted transformations, which brings on their own challenges, right? A lot of times you think small, and you're like, oh, okay, we can actually do this in a small, but small doesn't necessarily mean efficient, and it doesn't mean that you're going to cover all aspects of a transformation. So I think that, it's a transformation has kind of really, changed over the years, but a lot of companies are still doing transformation, for the right reasons, right? They're looking for, dealing with and addressing around their customers and the customer centricity. They're looking at their process optimization. They're looking at, their data and how to utilize their data, that they have internally in the organization, technology modernization, cultural changes within the organization, but also they're looking at as far as like, how do I address the people aspect? And, we'll talk more about this, but again, as I said in the introductions, I started my career in the 90s, and, people, process, and technology was a key. I think everyone has seen the bubbles around people, process, technology, and kind of how they interchange. That's been, a big focus around transformation.
Yeah, and so if you think about those three bubbles that you just mentioned, people, process, and technology, do you have a sense of where these big projects fail the most? Is it because they're not bringing the people along? I mean, tech is tech, right? I mean, there's people can make tech do a lot of things. Do you think it's around the process or the people, or where do you think it kind of falls down?
I think it falls down, and it's a great question. And I think it really kind of falls down in the people side of it, right? So I think that, you have, and this is kind of going into like why fails and why transformation fails, and how you start a project. I think that, a lot of times companies will, and clients over the years, I've seen them good and bad, but I've seen the transformations, really kind of focus on, it's a technology driven, right? So they're bringing in a technology that they've made a choice on, but they really haven't gone through and thinking about from the process of the people standpoint. Or, they want to, as an afterthought, they want to, oh, well, we need to optimize our processes. And that's great, but like, what is the effect on the people? All right. I
Yep.
would say overall, Michael, is that, technology and process is probably, the main drivers. And you see a lot of companies when they do, DX, is they're focused on, the technology and the process, but they're forgetting a lot of them. And this is, one of the things I've seen a lot of failures on is they're not really focusing on the people aspect, the change management, the
Yep.
addressing as far as the training, the skills, the information, and, because they're not leveraging the data from their company, to understand that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think back to some of the big projects that I've either been a part of or watched, and I think a big warning sign is when somebody in the operations side, the people side of it says, "Why are we doing this?" Right, and they haven't been properly communicated. Is it sometimes just as simple as communicating very consistently about the why?
Well, it's, in those of you that are on the call from a change management standpoint, there's multiple components of change management, right? There's, stakeholder analysis, right? There's, making sure that there's alignment, making sure there's readiness, there's training, there's communication. All those kind of play into it. And to be honest with you, a lot of that stuff that I just kind of mentioned is not even included in a lot of the,
Yeah,
DX projects, right? Especially these days, right? It's just not prevalent that I see. I think that there are companies that understand that. I've been working with a couple different companies where they, see it and they want to bring it into it, but it's the skills aren't even out there, right? As much. I mean, there are some great change management, organizations and consulting organizations out there, but again, it's money. And, when budgets are tight, what do they cut? They cut the change management, unfortunately. And that the change management is what really kind of drives the success, in my
yeah,
opinion, because if you're not addressing the people, you can have the greatest technology out there. You could
yeah,
have best processes out there. But if you're not addressing that kind of that readiness and that alignment and that the overall kind of transformational aspect of getting people organized and making sure they're on the same page, you're not going to have a good success.
yeah.
And that's probably the number one reasons why a lot of transformations actually fail is there isn't that alignment, there isn't that sponsorship, there aren't the KPIs, the budgets, and everything else.
Yeah, so that's interesting. And I want to just mention to anybody that wants to ask Tony a question, if you're on LinkedIn Live or YouTube Live, feel free to type it in, and we'll answer them as they come up. So let's move on to what a COE is. Some people may know exactly what it is. Others, so it's a center of excellence. And so, can you kind of help us understand? Rulesware puts an emphasis on it. Can you talk about what is a COE, or what should a COE be? Maybe, and then we can talk about what they're not. Maybe later.
It's a it's a COE is one of my passions. I've set up and established a number of COEs across multiple different industries and companies, and I've seen them also where I haven't been involved as far as the failures and so on. But let me kind of start off with first the elephant in the room, COE, right? So Center of Excellence, right? It's got a bad rap, right? And I've heard them and I've seen them called different things, from everything from the COE, the Federated Value Center, which is a term that I've actually, kind of used with a lot of different companies lately. But competency centers, strategic planning teams, plow teams, the list goes on, of calling them something different. But
Yeah.
why? Why are they called something different? It's to be honest with you, it's because the COE in a lot of companies have a bad rap, right? They have a bad rap because a lot of COEs have failed, and there's a lot of failures. In fact, I'm speaking to a number of clients, where they're explaining to me, it's like, oh well, we can't use the COE term because we tried a COE and it failed. And I asked the question, why did it fail? Well, they didn't have the right measurements, the sponsorships, the leadership involved in, and so on, and that all kind of plays into kind of the failures of the COE. So that's really why the COE is it's a great topic, and I think that it is something that is needed in more companies than it's not needed. Unfortunately, a lot of companies don't know how to kick it off, or like I said, they've failed, or they have another consulting company in and not listening and just putting something in and diving into establishing a COE, and it fails. And unfortunately, I've seen more failures, than its successes at COEs, which is again why COEs have a bad rap, and it shouldn't, because COEs drive efficiencies, right? There's a lot of benefits, from a COE that you should actually leverage, in your organization, right? And there's a lot of things that are great things that a COE, from a leadership alignment. There's stakeholder engagement. There's a better communication across the organization, people around the IT and the business and operations. There's org design, enhancements that you can do, as part of the COE training, making sure your people, are skilled up in the right roles. There's a lot of benefits to a COE around just measurements and making sure there's efficiencies.
Yeah. And so what would you say are the two or three, four qualities of a good COE?
The typical qualities of a COE that I've actually like is number one is you have to have sponsorship. Number one thing is you need the right sponsor, right? You need someone at the right level. And this kind of goes into some of the failures. And in fact, I wrote a white paper on the 6 reasons why COEs fail. So I'll kind of talk from the opposite aspect of that. Is you need to have that sponsorship. You need to make sure that they actually have alignment in regards to what they're doing. You have to have someone that at a senior level who has a budget, right? So the other thing is having that budget, right? Making sure that you have money aligned and set aside, so that you're not always scrapping around and trying to get the right resources. And oh, it's a failure because I don't have to the budget to be successful. So you need to have that. You need to have, I think, another third key one is around KPI measurements, right? If you are not measuring and you're not setting up your KPIs for a COE and you're not measuring that, you're going to be at risk, because then we're like, what's the value, right? So you have to establish that value, from the beginning. And then you have to have the right resources and the right skills, is a key thing when it comes to having a successful. So, you don't want to have too large of an organization, but you have to have the right skills within their COE, and it should be a lean COE that's really driving things. So, KPIs, goals, funding, sponsorship, the right organization, alignment across, both the business and IT all kind of play into what makes a successful COE.
So it strikes me that and when you talk about a COE, you're not necessarily talking to center it around a product, but a functional area. And with AI, I mean, my goodness, there's so many elements of AI coming at us so fast. This seems like a place for a COE, because somebody's got to kind of filter the noise, make sure they can apply the technology, no matter how brilliant the technology is. If it doesn't apply in your enterprise, then we don't need to be talking about it, right? So I mean, tell us a little bit about that. So maybe I started the question with, you don't center around a product, you center around what?
It's a great question, Michael, and again, it kind of goes along with. I think there's a whole theme on this call around why COEs fails and how to address that and how do you make it successful, right? So, one of the things that I have seen in a lot of the COEs I've created, and been involved with and observed is that there are technology COEs, right? So, there's in some companies, I'm working with, they have a COE for Salesforce. They have a Pega system COE, or an SAP COE. But I've also seen, organizations set up a COE from a functional aspect of like, digital transformation and as far as marketing and that a COE is dedicated marketing, or there's a COE, engineering technical COE and or business COE. What's wrong with all that is that they're siloed, right? Organizations are already siloed, right? And
Yeah.
if you really want true efficiencies, in an organization, I'm not saying anything new that no one else knows, is that you got to break down those silos. You got to figure out how to actually create those synergies. And if you set up a COE properly, I think it shouldn't be organized by technology, or a siloed, or operations organization. It really should be cross, and that's where those companies that have the most successful, COEs that have stand the test of time have really kind of solved that issue in regards to, we're not just focusing on one technology, we're not just focusing on one area within our organization. It's kind of crossing. Now you may have different levels. So you may have, in fact, I've been working with a bank, where we're talking through as far as how there's a COE at the top level, right, that manages, and you may have like an SAP or a Salesforce or a Pega, COE underneath that, as a subgroup that's focused on specialty stuff, but you still have the KPIs in the organization of COE at top that's actually driving that efficiencies and commonality across there, because a COE is really all about efficiencies. It's about, your people, making sure that you're leveraging the skills in your people to drive. It's about commonality, and the reusability of things, of like, instead of recreating processes altogether or APIs or, connectors or so on, as far as how can you reuse that, that's going to drive the efficiencies. And if you're set up in silos, no one's going to know what everyone else is doing.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, what I'm curious, and I'm asking you a question we didn't talk about before when we were preparing, but what would be the top three KPIs of a COE? Is it adoption? Is it efficiency? What would be kind of the three key things you need to measure in your COE?
I think number one is, from a, let's see, I would say the most important KPI from my perspective, and just kind of my perspective, is, as far as the outcomes, right? Like, what are you trying to accomplish, right? So, and then it depends on what the COE is, as far as then it's around reusability. So, you can measure reusability, within your applications, right? But then I would say the third one is around kind of the efficiencies kind of KPI, as far as like how long is it taking, to build out applications, right? COE is all around, it's going to be about efficiencies for building out applications. How long does it take, right, to do that? The fourth one I would say is kind of hard to measure, but it's around kind of skill development. And I mean, you need to actually have the tools in there to set that up,
Yeah.
to understand, what are the skills that you have within the organization. But I would say that those probably top four would be it. And the skills would be, you have to have the right tools in there to measure kind of the skills. You have to have that baseline, and then you kind of measure and so on. But I think that if you don't, you have to have organizations are a lot of times not looking at that and the skills of the individuals, and it's much easier to hire and then actually then train or develop individuals. But I see those organizations where a COE is really developing their workforce, that helps with retention, that helps with performance, that helps with, as far as having an organization that's customer centric, customer focused.
Yeah, yeah, that's fascinating. I think I just wanted to mention, you mentioned a white paper. For anybody that wants that white paper that's watching this, even if you're not watching it live, you watch this later, just DM me and LinkedIn. That'll be the fastest way to get that content to you if you're interested in that. So, okay, so let's talk a little bit about running a COE, right? So thinking about the processes, well, this is a habit architect show, so let's talk about the habits of a COE, the healthy habits that need to be a part of the COE.
Yeah. So there's a number. I would say, from my experience again, that I'll just kind of rattle off a couple that I think are really important for running a COE is, you know, daily check-ins, with the teams, right? I think that you need to have kind of the stand-ups, and that team needs to be, aligned. Whether daily, and I'm a kind of an agile person, so I like kind of daily stand-ups, and I think it's important, for teams, especially small teams that are, across multiple different areas, to have that daily kind of check in and make sure that there's alignment there. I think that, one of the things that a COE is also should be doing is staying informed with, trends. They should, your leadership team from a COE standpoint should be understanding as far as some of the trends. As you kind of mentioned at the very beginning, AI is a disruptor. There's a lot of stuff coming out. There's a lot of technologies out there. There's a lot of information overload out there. So I do think it's really important, and this is not just a COE. I think this is in general. Any business professional should spend their day, understanding what's the latest news in the industry, maybe that they're in, or in technology, or what's happening, to understand some of their daily trends and so on. I think it needs to, making sure that you're looking at your measurements, right? You need to have some kind of dashboard. You
Yeah.
just kind of mentioned about the KPIs. So I think you need to look at kind of the measurements and understanding as far as how, you're actually measuring, and how you're actually, attaining kind of that measurements, because those KPIs should be going to your sponsors. We talked about the sponsor, kind of
Yeah.
looping it back. You need to have your executive sponsors and so on. They're going to want to know as far as, are you meeting kind of the needs, right? You've set up KPIs when you establish it. They need measurements to make sure that the funding is going to stay there and the value is there. So
Yeah.
you need to make sure that you have a dashboard that you're establishing, that you're measuring, and your KPIs
Yeah.
are measurable, and you're measuring them. So those are some like habits from a standpoint, but then it's flexibility, Michael. It's like I said, every COE is different, right? So, you have different priorities and so on. It could be around skills, right? It could be around, processes that need to be done, meeting with your counterparts. I think it's really important that a lot of times in a COE, as I mentioned, you need to break down those silos. It's really key to have two key individuals. You need to have a leader, but you also need to have someone that's kind of representing the business side of the house,
Mhm.
and operations, and you need to have someone that's representing the technical side of the house. And having those regular check-ins with them is really, really important to make sure that you're meeting their needs, you're understanding their understanding as far as their requirements, understand what their needs are. Because
Yeah.
at the end of the day is, and Ian asked this question, but I think it's really important is that, what COEs, when they fail, this a lot of times the COEs fail is because they're either too bureaucratic or regulated,
Yeah.
meaning as far as they're gatekeepers to doing things. And in fact, a very large bank here in the U.S., they disbanded their COE because the individual business departments felt that their COE was too bureaucratic. It actually did not allow for creativity and
Yeah.
development. It was preventing them from doing things. So that, is one thing that you need to make sure that, you're having those regular conversations with the clients, with your business and IT, to make
Yeah.
sure that you're aligned with them, and making sure that they're seeing you as a partner, not as an adversary, for them to get the work done.
Yeah, that's interesting. When you said it that way, it made me think that you're right. If the COE takes the wrong posture, then it can be very off-putting. But if you are setting it up as an incubator or innovation center, or whatever the right adjective is,
Great
then
word.
you're actually helping the business participate in the next evolution of what it's going to look like, right?
Absolutely. Like innovation is, and again, that's something that is not. Those successful COEs are all about innovation and efficiencies and outcomes. Those three keywords I'll just flash out there, because they're really key. But that innovation is so really important. You want your team and you want your developers. Then developers. When I mean developers, your developers are not just technical, their operations, their business people also. They should have a
Yeah.
say into what's going on. But you need to have that innovation, in this organization to really kind of drive that. So having that innovation is going to drive the COE. It's going to help the company out. And if
Yeah.
you actually, prosper and you actually encourage that innovation, your people are going to be happy, the projects are going to be more successful, and you're going to have a better outcome.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting, and that I like that concept. So what is the kind of number? By the way, we've got a couple of comments. One that says this is very insightful from Reem, and then I'm sorry I can't read the name. Rashib, I think, says thank you, Tony. So not a question, but a thank you. Maybe that's easier.
Thank you for commenting. I appreciate that, and I'm glad that you find this interesting. It's like I said, it's a passion of mine, and it's something that I love to talk about and work with companies to give a different perspective.
Yeah, it's awesome. So what would you say is a non-negotiable? So a company comes to you and they say, Tony, we think we are at a point where we need to set up a COE. What is one non-negotiable or two non-negotiables that you would say you've got to be prepared to do this?
Number one is, as I mentioned earlier, is that you need to have an executive sponsor, that is aligned, that can make decisions, that has a budget, and that can cross over both business and IT. So you need to have, if you go and get a sponsor that, let's say you want to set up a COE, and I'm like, oh, I have my COO wants to sponsor a COE, but is your business aligned with that? Oh, no, no, no. We just want an IT COE. Well, you're setting yourself up for failure right there. So having that executive alignment is probably the number one. The second thing that's non-negotiable, in setting up a COE is those KPIs, right? You have to have that alignment, on and that accountability on that kind of those KPIs, and making sure that you're defining, because if you don't define those KPIs, and that's probably one of the first things I do when we set up a COE. And as I mentioned, working for Rulesware, when we approach COEs, one of the first things we do is do that alignment and understand, and we talk to them about like what it is that they're looking to do, why, if they've set up a COE, why it's failed. But then as far as pulling in and understanding, as far as like, what is it you're trying to accomplish? And then we'll kind of talk through as far as like who's your sponsor is, what are the measurements? What are you looking to accomplish as part of the COE? You just can't start a COE and say, oh, I want to put a COE because I want better processes and efficiencies. It's broader and bigger than that, right, Michael? So you need to make sure that you really kind of think through those KPIs. So non-negotiable for me is making sure you have that leadership, that have that sponsorship, and then you have that accountability, with measurable KPIs from the beginning.
Yep. Yeah, that's great.
They may change, right?
Yeah.
You got to have that flexibility, but you need to have some from the beginning. You have to have those KPIs.
Yeah. Years ago, I was a part of a project that involved, of all things, the Florida Department of Transportation. So, if you think about Department of Transportations in any state, they're one of the most hated groups, not because of anything other than when there's road construction, everybody gets upset, right? So the interesting thing about it is that one of the elements they put in their COE for improvement, it was less about the road materials or how to reroute traffic. It was more about how do we communicate in a different way. And so they opened up this ideation capability where people could make suggestions, and it really invigorated the DOT employees because they felt like they were part of solving a problem. And I think you described that a little bit, not only just an executive leadership, but also just that innovation spirit that can play an interesting role across the employees, even if they're not part of the COE, right?
Yep. Agree. Absolutely.
Yeah, very good. Sorry, that wasn't a question, was it? It was kind of more.
That's a great comment, though, and aligns with everything we're talking about.
I get it. Okay, so when you've got a COE running, because you said there in the last statement that you did that things change, right?
Yeah.
So is there a way that you spot COE fatigue, or maybe it's drifting off the core mission? Or how do you, because setting up the COE is one thing, but just kind of, let's say you're a year into it or 2 years into it, is there a way that you could spot, hey, we need to kind of fix things here?
Absolutely. And, for a lot of us on this call, probably, we've been involved with application developments. And, what's the most important thing of any kind of application development is the retrospect, is understanding and looking back. What could I have done better, different? What could I have done better? How do I improve? And if you're not doing that, you should be doing that. Number one, but it's kind of the same works from a COE standpoint. It's not, you're not doing projects, because a COE is not doing, building out applications, right? They're more at a higher level, driving those efficiencies and ensuring outcomes or repeatability. But I do think that the COE, as just as I said, the team does stand-ups. I think that you have to have regular check-ins, and regular assessments, of your organization, of your COE. Am I meeting my KPIs? And again, everything will come back to the KPIs, right?
Yep.
Am I achieving my KPIs? I would have regular meetings with your sponsor, your executive sponsor, but also your other sponsors, your business, IT, operations organization. You need to have those regular communications, right? You need to have those reach outs. If you don't have the relationships with them, and you're not having the conversations with, hey, are we meeting your needs? What would you change? What do you need to focus on? What do we need to do differently, right? If you're not getting that input from your sponsors,
Yep.
within organization, you're going to, again, set yourselves up for failure, right? You're not having that regular communication. So I think the regular assessment and the regular communications with your sponsorships, is going to help you from drifting, as you call it, away from a successful COE. Because, if you're just put your blinders on, and again, unfortunately, I've seen a number, I'm not going to name, clients, but I've seen a number of accounts where clients where they've, failed in their COEs because I call the blinder effect, right? They just put the blinders on and they're just marching along. Like I said, they're very siloed, and they're kind of building out what they think they need, and, or you'll have another thing I kind of mentioned is there's a lot of consulting companies out there. I came from a couple of them, and, they pitch as far as the COEs and
Yep.
developing COEs. And they tell you, they don't listen. They tell you what to do instead of listening and understanding what you want to do. And a lot of that will drift, right? Because you will drift your successful COEs because you don't have that your real true assessment and communication, and you're not listening to your stakeholders and
Yep.
understanding what they're looking to accomplish. Because funding is, if you don't have the funding, you're not going to be successful. You're not going to have a COE. So
Yep.
how do you keep that funding? You need to make sure that you're actually listening to your sponsors and making sure that you're addressing their concerns.
Yeah. Great. That's awesome. So let's go to a rapid fire area. Uh, let's start with what's a myth about CEOs that needs to die?
Well, I think he said CEO. I think you mentioned COE,
I meant
right?
yeah, yes, yeah, sorry.
Uh,
That's,
there's a lot of myths of CEOs,
yeah,
but
yeah,
but a myth, I would say, a myth that COEs die is that a COE is, let's see, a good myth that a COE. I think that a myth is that a COE is only focusing on one product, as we kind of mentioned earlier, right? Or one technology. I think that, or one area. I think that that is like that's old school kind of thinking. I would say, and kind of I talked about as far as the people, process, and technology at the beginning, and that was really big back in the '90s, and then it drifted away in I would say the 2000s, and it was mainly focused on process and technology. I think that that's where society and technology and organizations have organized.
yeah,
But I think that that's probably one of the biggest myth is that a COE has to be only organized by a technology like
yeah,
Pega or SAP or Salesforce or whatever.
yeah. I think that's spot on too. I think that those uh, the shelf life of a COE centered solely around the technology is short because
They change, right?
yeah, 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 yeah.
Technologies come and go.
Yeah, and that and it's if you're only siloed on that, and if your eyesight is only focused on that, you're missing some of the things that could help that technology even be better. So that's a great one. All right, let's start with this next one, and I want try not to get this right. One question every exec should ask themselves before starting a transformation.
Do I have the right KPIs? Do I have the right leadership to ensure the success? And do I have the alignment across my organization to drive those collaboration and efficiencies and outcomes?
Excellent, excellent. And one more, if you could instill one habit in every COE tomorrow in the team that runs a COE tomorrow, what would it be?
Listening. Uh,
Ah, nice.
listening, listening to your listening to your sponsors and listening to what the things. Now that doesn't mean you have to act or react on it, but I
Yeah.
think it's so important is to listen. And one of the things is active listening, right? So active listening is where you're repeating, you're understanding kind of what the questions that's being asked. So I think that but listening is so important that it's I see that failure all the time.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. That's a great way of answering that question because I think sometimes when you think about center of excellence or subject matter expert, people tend to want to tell them everything they know about it as opposed to listening. I think that's a great observation, a great
But
comment.
just to add to that, Michael, is I was working in a healthcare company here in the U.S. and they've actually attempted two COEs and they do see the value, but they want to do something different. And so we got into a conversation around how we approach things at Rulesware differently. And and I kind of mentioned as far as the biggest thing is listening. And they says, well, what do you mean? And I'm like, well, before I come in and tell you what a COE should do and how it should do, I want to listen to you. I want to understand why your COEs have failed. What have you done in the past, right? I want to understand, all that aspects around, what you've done and what you want and then go forward. And the response from the executive was, that's really enlightening because every other consulting company that I've brought in to talk to me about COE has just told us what I needed to do and how to do it without understanding why it's failed or what I'm looking to accomplish.
Yeah.
So listening is so important, and it's been, again, from my experience, it's been, verified, with companies that that is really important. Just don't come in and tell us what to do. Listen.
Yeah. No, that's great. Great advice to sort of end on. Before we end, though, I wondered if you could tell people if they wanted to pick up a conversation with you, what's the best way to contact you, and maybe just a blurb about Rulesware too.
Absolutely. So thanks, Michael. Best way to get in touch with me is LinkedIn. My profile's up there, so I'm pretty much on LinkedIn every single day. In my job and my role.
Yep.
So please actually reach out to me if you have any questions around a COE or consulting digital transformation. Let us know. Rulesware, like I said, I've been with the company for 2 years, but it's a company that is a Pega only company. So it is a consultancy, delivery organization that is based here in the United States. But our big change or our big differentiator is that, one of them is, we've approached 20 years ago. So the company was founded 20 years ago by a gentleman by the name of Anthony Lee. And, he set it up as a differentiator from a lot of other consulting companies that weren't doing implementations of Pega really well. So he looked at, setting up, we looked at offshore, nearshore, and he actually developed a nearshore operating model where we have our offices and our resources down in San Salvador, El Salvador, and Guadalajara, Mexico. And we got some spot on, incredible, talented resources in those regions that we're using. But we do a lot of transformations. We focus on really three industries. We don't try and boil the ocean. We are more of a boutique than a large consultancy. So we focus on financial services, insurance, and healthcare as our three main industries. We do a lot of modernization, cloud, but we also do a lot of specialties, consulting and advisory, where we listen. We really spend more time understanding. We've adopted with being that we're a Pega shop. We leverage all the different technologies. We have some of the deepest skills in Pega on the currency on the latest app. And I think that's really important from my standpoint is because our resources are trained always on the latest current application because Pega comes up with new additions all the time. So, and the technology is changing, making sure that you're always leveraging the latest technology instead of a technology or a version of Pega that was built 6 years ago is
Yep.
so important, right? So we do a lot of development and delivery. We spend a lot of time doing COEs, and we're also working with. We just have a new partnership. I just want to put a spotlight out there on Active Ops. So Active Ops is one of our newest partnerships that we work with, and we're really excited about bringing that together and driving new kind of modernization and new way of looking at it around data, because ActiveOps is all around the data. Pega is around collecting the data. So I think that the marriage between Pega and ActiveOps to drive digital transformation is an incredible partnership. So we've been posting some stuff on LinkedIn, and you'll see more about that in at Pega World that's coming up next weekend, as well, in 2 weekends. And then also you'll see some stuff on LinkedIn as far as some like white papers and some positionings around the partnership as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, our team here hates him in particular. I don't know if you could see the banner, Tony, while you're talking, but he said booth 28 in Las Vegas, and let's connect and everything. So Hatham did applaud to Hatham, but also just to everybody, if you're in Vegas and want to catch Rulesware, booth 28 in Pega World there. So Tony, thank you so much for joining me today. This was awesome. Uh, I mean, I think there's so much more we could talk about, but we try to keep these within 45 minutes. So I do encourage you to go find Tony on LinkedIn, connect with him. If you do want that white paper, drop me a LinkedIn, a DM, or Tony. If you connect with him directly, and we'll get that white paper to you. Next week, we have we're going to carry on with kind of the business operations standpoint. We're going to have Shannon Prager on with Lead It Marketing, and she's going to talk about demand generation and some of the subtleties around that and the changes that have occurred in that with AI and everything else. So we're looking forward to having Shannon next week. So tune into that on YouTube or LinkedIn. And Tony, thanks again. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Hatham. It's been it's a pleasure, and would love to actually come back and talk about other topics as well if you would have me.
Absolutely. We had a guest last week that also we decided we have a 2.0, so we'll have Tony 2.0 on here.
That'd be wonderful. I appreciate that. Thank you very much, and thank you for everyone that's been listening and participating. I was looking at the comments and around the insightfulness, and like I said, we'll get you those white paper presentations as well.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.